And our first speaker is Richard Wilkinson, who unexpectedly became a bestseller writer with his book Spirit Level, published in 2009 with Kate Pickett. Richard is professor at Nottingham University and University College London, and he's going to talk to us about the importance of equality in societies and how more equal societies deliver all kinds of dividends. Richard.
Thank you. Well, good morning. It's nice to be here and nice to see other people who've got out of bed in time. What I want to do is to show you how greater equality, smaller income differences between rich and poor, make a sustainable economy more attainable. But before I do that, I want to give you just a hint of the power of inequality and what it does to our societies. I like to start off with this slide because it shows how miserable we all are. And you know, every person there is scowling and frowning. It's outside Oxford Street Tube Station in London. And I think part of what I have to say is related to the sort of contrast between the material success of our societies and their many social failings. And, you know, the press and media are bothered about these things all the time. What I think happens, and what I'm not really going to have time to show you, is that all the problems that are more common at the bottom of society, whether you look at violence or drug abuse or teenage births or obesity or, you know, ill health, physical and mental health, all those things tend to be worse at the bottom of society. I don't mean that there isn't violence and ill health at the top as well. All those things get worse if you increase the status differences, if you increase the inequality. Basically, because more inequality amplifies all the effects of class and status on us. So all the ways in which class and status imprint themselves on us from early childhood onwards get stronger where there's more inequality in a society. When I talk about inequality, I'm never talking about utopian, perfect, equal societies. I'm simply talking about the scale of income differences within each of the rich, developed market democracies where you can get really good data. How much richer is the top 20% in each country than the bottom 20%? These are the figures we use. And you see in the more equal countries, Japan and those Nordic countries on the left, inequality is only about half as great on that measure as in countries like the UK, Portugal, USA, Singapore on the right-hand end. Huge differences amongst societies that perhaps we regard as fairly similar market democracies. I want to sort of show you what that does to our societies. When I say it makes problems that are more common at the bottom of society worse, we put together data from international sources on life expectancy in each country, on kids' maths and literacy scores, on infant mortality rates, homicide rates, imprisonment, that's proportion of the population in prison, teenage birth rates, how much people trust each other as a measure of social cohesion, obesity rates, mental illness and social mobility. And there you see all those things in one index related to the scale of inequality, the measure I've just shown you, the figures I've just shown you for each country. And what you're seeing there is that the more unequal societies do consistently worse. USA, Portugal, UK up on the top right, and the Nordic countries and Japan on the bottom left. And of course, people often think this is about poverty and we need more economic growth. That's nonsense. Same figures for each country up the side, showing all these problems here in relation to economic growth. Some societies here are twice as rich as others, and it makes no difference to these problems. Health, life expectancy is no longer driven by GNP per capita, nor is measures of happiness and well-being. And the same applies to measures of child well-being. This is the UNICEF index of child well-being, against the same measure of inequality. Children doing substantially worse in the more unequal countries. You see, they're doing worst in that same bunch of countries, USA, Portugal, UK. New Zealand, and well in Finland, Sweden, Norway, so on. And once again, in case anyone doubted it, although we do talk about child poverty as the problem, it's relative poverty that matters, not absolute in these rich developed countries. In poorer countries, it's really important for people to have higher material standards. But in the rich world, getting more and more of everything makes less and less difference. And here you see countries twice as rich as others makes no difference to those UNICEF measures of child well-being. But inequality, really important. This basically just tells us the intuition that people have always had that inequality is divisive and socially corrosive. The data shows us that is truer than we ever expected. And of course, what people have always intuited is that inequality is divisive. And here you see how it relates to trust from the World Values Survey. Up the side, you've got the proportion of people who feel they can trust others, who agree that most people can be trusted. It falls as low as 15% of people feeling they can trust others in the more unequal societies. Rises to 60 or 65% in the more equal societies. If I showed you measures of social capital, involvement in community life, just the same picture. Look at Putnam's work, both his earlier Italian study and his Bowling Alone in the United States. If you look carefully in the footnotes and so on, really powerful relations with inequality, income inequality. I'm going to come back to that, but basically, all these problems, here's a summary, get worse in more unequal societies. It damages the quality of the social environment, our relations with each other. Now I want to show you what it does to sustainability and our chances of reaching sustainability. I'm going to make basically these 3 points. First, that reducing carbon emissions, people often feel it's an enormous sacrifice. If we have to give up the amazing benefits of economic growth. As I say, economic growth is what's transformed the real quality of our lives over the last couple of centuries. But it's no longer doing that. Measures of well-being, life expectancy, and so on are no longer affected by growth. They improve, measures of health improve, but no longer related to economic growth in the rich world. And then I'm going to show you that greater inequality intensifies consumerism. Consumerism is the biggest threat to reducing carbon emissions and reaching sustainability. But it's about status competition, and it's intensified by inequality. And lastly, dealing with environmental problems means acting, I suppose, in relation to the greater good. And because in more unequal societies, people trust each other less, there's more violence, community life weakens, that sense of public spiritedness declines. People are more out for themselves. I'm going to show you that too. But first, this is life expectancy in relation to CO2 emissions per capita. You can't read the names of the countries, I expect, but out on the right-hand, top right, you've got USA, Australia, Saudi Arabia, then the poorer countries rising in that left-hand, on the left-hand side. But what you can see there is that there are huge increases in carbon emissions in the rich world, that long flat bit of that graph at the top, which bring no further benefits to life expectancy. And so if we have to reduce our carbon emissions, it doesn't mean sacrificing really important things. This is not the only example. You can show this with other outcomes as well. Measures of happiness don't decline. We achieve modern standards of life expectancy at much lower levels of carbon emissions. And I think it's really important to get people to see that, whether it's about reducing inequality or about reaching sustainability, it's about getting to a better world, qualitatively better for all of us, not making huge and painful sacrifices. We've got to change that way of thinking. One of the indications of the extent to which inequality drives consumerism by intensifying status competition is you see that in more unequal societies, people work much longer hours. They work the equivalent of a couple of months longer each year, because in a more unequal society, money matters even more. It says what you're worth. In more unequal societies, people get into debt more. They save less. And basically, it is that you get into that very alienated way of showing your value and your worth in relation to others. I pointed out that more unequal societies are more public-spirited because community life is stronger, because people trust each other more, because that sense that you have to fend for yourself, we're all out for ourselves, that sense is weaker. You can see that partly in the donations countries make in foreign aid. The more equal countries are the ones that give the most in development aid. There's quite a scatter, but it's a highly significant relationship. You can look at other things to do with environmental issues. This is the proportion of journeys people make by bicycle in different countries. Again, people use bicycles more in more equal societies. And I think that is partly because, the car is the great status of, a symbol of status. And bikes look a bit weak. And in societies where you have to show you're tough and so on, you get a 4x4 with names like Defender and Shogun and so on. That rugged individualism is part of the culture of inequality. This is data from an international survey of opinions of business leaders. They were asked to say how important they thought international environmental agreements were. And people, business leaders in more equal countries, think that environmental issues are much more important than they do in more unequal countries. In the more unequal countries, they feel basically that they have to fend for themselves. The environment is not their business. But not so in the more equal countries. So, on those three counts, that reducing carbon emissions, doing with slower growth or no growth, does not mean making great sacrifices. It's about moving towards a better world. In terms of reining in consumerism, the big threat to any attempt to deal with these issues, means reducing inequality, because inequality drives status competition, and that's what so much of consumerism is about. And lastly, the public-spiritedness we all need, the awareness of the greater good. That is fostered by better community relations that are destroyed by greater inequality. The last one, I think, is this one just showing that even when you look at the amount of waste, this is, I think, 5 different waste materials, metals, glass, paper, plastic, so on, recycled. More equal societies do better on that too. So if we're really going to deal with this problem, we've got to deal with things to do with the quality of social relations between us. It allows us, it enables us to act in the common good. But also, you know, this is the Henry Wallach, a former governor of the US Federal Reserve Bank, who said growth is a substitute for a greater equality of income. So long as there's growth, there is hope. He meant that people feel they're moving up, and although they're still deprived and so on in relation to others, you get a sense that things are improving, you're doing better than your parents, and so you're less likely to demand equality. But actually, if one is a substitute for the other, then greater equality is a precondition for moving towards a steady-state economy. And let's hope we can change our society from something as miserable as this to something a little bit more cheerful. This is an Irish street party, I think. If you want more of this kind of stuff, you can get it on our website or in our book. Thank you.
Wow, Richard, that was an amazing talk, really inspiring, and I'm going to visit your website. Those graphs really merit looking closely at.
Well, they suggest something's going on that's important,
yeah, and
that we have to take into account.
there's so many of them that you have to take the linkages seriously.
I deal in graphs.
It's not just bicycles. I thought the bicycles was a bit...
That's a new one.
Funny. Okay, here's a good question that's come from Carrie King from the University of Texas, Austin. And she is asking, how many of the measures of inequality are related to the homogeneity of race and culture within countries? That is to say, is there a positive relationship between homogeneity and equality?
That's a question that always comes from Americans.
Oh, right, okay.
People have controlled for ethnic mix in different societies. And of course, actually, the biggest ethnic minority in the US are Hispanics. The bizarre thing about the Hispanic population in the US, although they're as poor as the African-American population and as badly educated or worse because they come from Mexico, their health is almost as good as non-Hispanic whites. This is not about what's happening to a poor minority. We're all affected by it. You sometimes find tenfold...
We're all affected by it?
Yes, you sometimes find tenfold differences in rates of teenage pregnancy, in rates of imprisonment, in levels of violence in some studies. The differences are so big because it's not just a poor minority affected by this. And in studies where you can look and see, look at people at each level in the social class hierarchy, how they do in more and less equal societies, you see that the effects of inequality are biggest at the bottom of society, but even at the top there is a small benefit.
And the great middle, their health and their well-being is also dragged down.
Everyone benefits. So by that I mean not that necessarily that you'd be richer if you lived in a more equal society, but you'd be likely to live a little bit longer. Your children might do a bit better at school. They'd be less likely to become teenage parents or get involved in drugs. You'd be less likely to become a victim of violence. In that sense, we all do better in a more equal society.
And you're more likely to smile when you get out of public transport on your way to
I
work.
hope so.
Richard, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to buy your book right away.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.